Okay, let's start our today's topic. Our today's topic is female reproductive cycle or menstrual cycle. Are you hearing me? Can you hear me? Okay, no problem. So this menstrual cycle or female reproductive cycle, it starts in human females at the age of 10 to 12 years. So this time, when this menstrual cycle starts in human female, that start of menstrual cycle is known as menarche. At this time, the female becomes reproductively active. At this time, the female becomes reproductively fertile, right? This cycle continues up to the age of 45 to 50 years. And after age of 45 to 50 years, it stops. So this stop of menstrual cycle after the age of 45 to 50 years. Just a minute, let me allow them to join first. Okay. So this time when the menstrual cycle stops in the human females, that time is known as menopause. So onset of menstrual cycle in human females, that is known as menarche. This menarche, it occurs at the age of 10 to 12 years. This cycle continues up to the age of just a minute. This cycle continues up to the age of 45 to 50 years. When this cycle stops, this is known as menopause, right? So how does this cycle get its name, menstrual cycle? There is a Greek word, mensum. The Greek word mensum means a month. This cycle in human females, it is repeated after every, it is repeated after every 28 days. If the womb, if the womb is not fertilized, is not fertilized. So it will be repeated after every 28 days if the womb is not fertilized. 28 days are equal to a month. That is why it got the name menstrual cycle. Mensum is a Greek word meaning a month, right? So these changes they reoccur after every 28 days. For that reason, it is known as menstrual cycle. Mensum is a Greek word meaning a month, right? So what happens during this cycle, right? When this menstrual cycle starts, it is associated with some bleeding. At the onset of menstrual cycle, there is bleeding. So blood is lost. This blood loss, it is accompanied with unfertilized ovum. Unfertilized ovum, right? So this flow of blood along with unfertilized ovum from the female reproductive system, this is known as menses. This is known as menses. So if the ovum remains unfertilized, a human female is likely to suffer from loss of blood after every 28 days, and this loss of blood after every 28 days, when the ovum remains unfertilized, it is known as menses, and the cycle is known as menstrual cycle. So we can study this menstrual cycle under following heads. We divide menstrual cycle in these following heads, right? So I will divide this menstrual cycle into following phases so that we can completely understand what is happening in during this menstrual cycle. So this menstrual cycle can be divided into following. There are four phases. The first phase that we are going to discuss is known as proliferative phase. Proliferative phase, or it is known as follicular phase. The second phase that we are going to discuss is known as ovulatory phase. Its third phase is known as luteal phase, or we call it as progestational phase. And it is fourth phase, that is the menstrual phase. Actually, a menstrual cycle starts with the menstrual phase. So the menstrual phase must be the first phase. But for the sake of convenience, we will discuss it at the last, right? So our first phase, as per our discussion, will be proliferative phase. The second phase will be ovulatory phase. Third phase will be luteal phase or progestational phase. And its fourth phase will be menstrual phase, right? In reality, menstrual cycle starts with menstrual phase, right? So we can discuss this whole menstrual cycle under these four phases, right? The first phase, which is known as proliferative phase or follicular phase, it begins from the day 5th of the menstrual cycle and continues up to 14th day of menstrual cycle. So proliferative phase or follicular phase, it begins on the day 5th, right? And it continues up to day 14th of menstrual cycle, right? This phase lasts for some 10 to 12 days. Some 10 to 12 days, right? We are discussing a menstrual cycle of 28 days duration. However, in human females, this menstrual cycle, it suffers from a lot of deviation, lot of variation, right? In some females, the menstrual cycle may be of short duration. In some other females, the menstrual cycle may be of long duration, right? So there are variations in the period, in the length of this menstrual cycle in human females, right? But we are discussing a menstrual cycle which is of 28 days. It is considered to be as a standard cycle, right? So in this menstrual cycle of 28 days, right, the cycle starts on the menstrual phase. So from day 1st to day 4th, there is menstrual phase, right? This menstrual phase is followed by proliferative phase or follicular phase. So follicular phase starts on 5th day and it continues up to 14th day of menstrual cycle. So it lasts for 10 to 12 days. What happens during proliferative phase? What happens during this phase? We will discuss it step by step, right? Should I rub it? Should I rub this?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, okay. So we will discuss first proliferative phase in detail. My board is very small, so I have to rub it most frequently. It's a small board, so I need to rub it again and again. Okay. The first phase, proliferative phase. So in this proliferative phase, right, under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone from anterior pituitary, anterior pituitary secretes a hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, right? This follicle stimulating hormone converts, it stimulates the development of, it stimulates development of a primary ovarian follicle, into a mature Graafian follicle. So when this proliferative phase starts, right, or this follicular phase starts, in the beginning of this proliferative phase or follicular phase, anterior pituitary releases a hormone. Which hormone is released from anterior pituitary? Anterior pituitary releases, coming late to the class, anterior pituitary releases follicle stimulating hormone. This follicle stimulating hormone it stimulates the development of a primary ovarian follicle. A primary ovarian follicle is converted into a mature graphene follicle, right? So when a graphene follicle is formed, you know this graphene follicle, it is covered by theca, right? It has got a secondary oocyte at its center. The secondary oocyte is lying on a stalk of cells. This stalk of cells is known as cumulus oophorus or discus polygerus, right? This secondary oocyte is also surrounded by some follicular cells. Then there are follicular cells. Then they are externally covered by connective tissue of ovary, right? This is a secondary oocyte in graphene follicle, right? These are follicular cells surrounding the secondary oocyte. These are follicular cells lining the mature graphene follicle internally. These are the follicular cells lining the mature graphene follicle internally. So these follicular cells, they form theca interna. This is connective tissue of ovary itself, right? This connective tissue of ovary, it forms theca externa. Both of them are together known simply as theca, right? Right. So in this mature graphene follicle, a secondary oocyte is present. It is lying on a stalk of cells. This stalk of cells is known as cumulus oophorus. Or we also call it as discus polygerus. Then this secondary oocyte is surrounded by some follicular cells, and theca is also internally lined by follicular cells, right? Then these follicular cells are a mature graphene follicle. Follicular cells of graphene follicle. This start secreting a hormone. They start production of estrogen. They start release of estrogens. Listen to me again carefully. So when proliferative phase or follicular phase begins, anterior pituitary releases a hormone, follicle stimulating. What is the function of follicle stimulating hormone? It converts a primary ovarian follicle into a graphene follicle, right? So when a graphene follicle is formed like this. It has got a space in it, empty space. This is known as antrum. And around this antrum, there are the coverings, follicular cells and connective tissue of ovary. So this is known as theca. So when a primary ovarian follicle is changed into a graphene follicle under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone, then these follicular cells, they start a release of another hormone known as estrogens, right? Follicular cells, they start release of estrogens, right? These estrogens, they start the development of female reproductive system for the pregnancy, right? So these estrogens, they act on the fallopian tubes, they act on the uterine endometrium, and they bring changes. They bring about changes in the fallopian tubes and uterine endometrium. Did you follow up to this point? यहाँ तक समझ आ गया? Yes, sir. So in the beginning, follicle stimulating hormone will be produced by anterior pituitary. Follicle stimulating hormone will convert primary ovarian follicle into a graphene follicle. Then the follicular cells of graphene follicle, they will start a release of estrogens. Follicular cells will produce estrogen. This release of estrogens from follicular cells, it is stimulated by release of another hormone, luteinizing hormone, right? So estrogens are produced. Now these estrogens start developing their own effect. Which organs are affected by these estrogens? We will discuss now that. Estrogens, they act on fallopian tubes. Estrogens act on fallopian tubes. They make the fallopian tubes densely ciliated. You know the lumen of fallopian tubes is internally lined by ciliated columnar epithelium. Do you remember that? Do you remember that? So estrogens, they make fallopian tubes they make fallopian tubes densely ciliated. Densely ciliated. Or we can say they stimulate the growth of cilia, growth of ciliated epithelium in the fallopian tubes. Why they prepare the fallopian tubes? Why they make the fallopian tubes densely ciliated? So when the secondary oocyte will be released, it will be caught by the femri and it will go into fallopian tube. And then this ciliated epithelium of fallopian tube, it will carry this secondary oocyte towards the uterus. So for that purpose, estrogens make fallopian tubes densely ciliated. Then these estrogens, they also act on uterine endometrium. They stimulate growth of uterine endometrium. Uterine endometrium. Estrogens, they stimulate the growth of uterine endometrium. They increase the thickness of endometrium. So endometrium under the influence of estrogens becomes thick. Estrogens also stimulate growth of uterine glands. Yeah, actually called growth of endometrial glands. Growth of endometrial glands. Endometrial glands. So estrogens make endometrium rich in glands, right? And estrogens also make the endometrium vascular. They make endometrium vascular. That means estrogens stimulate the growth of blood vessels in uterine endometrium. Now the thickness of uterine endometrium is increased by 3 millimeter under the influence of estrogens, right? The thickness of uterine endometrium is increased by 3 millimeter under the influence of estrogens. So when the estrogens is released, when the estrogens are released, these estrogens, they make uterine endometrium thick, right? They increase its thickness by 3 millimeters, right? They increase the glandular content of the uterine endometrium. The endometrial glands, they proliferate, they become highly developed, so that this uterine endometrium becomes glandular. They stimulate the proliferation of blood vessels. So the uterine endometrium becomes rich in blood vessels. It becomes highly vascular, right? So this is the effect of estrogens, right? So what from estrogens are produced? Estrogens are released by follicular cells, right? So when estrogens are released, they increase the thickness of uterine endometrium. They make uterine endometrium glandular and vascular, right? Now these estrogens, they further stimulate. Estrogens further stimulate the release of luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone. Estrogens further stimulate the release of luteinizing hormone from anterior pituitary, right? So this luteinizing hormone, it stimulates the follicular cells. Luteinizing hormone stimulates follicular cells. Follicular cells to release liquor folliculi. Is this visible? Is this visible? Yes. Okay. It stimulates follicular cells to release liquor folliculi. Liquor folliculi into the antrum of the Graafian follicle. Do you understand what I am saying? Estrogens, they stimulate the follicular. Estrogens stimulates the release of luteinizing hormone from anterior pituitary. When estrogens are released, they stimulate anterior pituitary to release luteinizing hormone. This luteinizing hormone, it acts on follicular cells. Luteinizing hormone acts on follicular cells. So these follicular cells, they start releasing a fluid into the antrum. This fluid which is released into the antrum, this fluid is known as liquor folliculi. So this liquor folliculi accumulates in the antrum. Liquor folliculi accumulates in antrum. And accumulation of fluid in the antrum of Graafian follicle makes the Graafian follicle to swell up. It makes the graphene follicle to swell up. And graphene follicle now starts appearing as an outgrowth on the surface of ovary, right? So far, this graphene follicle was embedded within the cortex of the ovary, right? Now, as estrogen stimulate the release of luteinizing hormone from anterior pituitary, luteinizing hormone stimulates follicular cells to release liquid folliculi into antrum. As liquid folliculi accumulates in the antrum, this graphene follicle, it swells like a cyst, it enlarges like a cyst, and it starts protruding, it starts bulging on the surface of ovary. Now we can find this graphene follicle as a protuberance on the surface of ovary. As the fluid buildup continues, this theca cannot withstand, the theca cannot bear the pressure of this fluid in the antrum. So because of the pressure of the fluid in the antrum, this theca becomes weak and this theca bursts open. As the fluid accumulation continues into the antrum, this theca, it cannot withstand, it cannot bear the pressure and it bursts open. As the theca bursts open, this secondary oocyte is released from a graphene follicle. This secondary oocyte is released from a graphene follicle. This release of secondary oocyte from the graphene follicle, what is it known as? A release of secondary oocyte from the graphene follicle. It is now known as ovulation, right? So, which hormone helps in ovulation? Under the influence of which hormone ovulation occurs? Shabbat? Which hormone helps in the ovulation? It is the luteinizing hormone, right? So when luteinizing hormone is released from anterior pituitary, luteinizing hormone stimulates follicular cells to release liquor folliculi. Follicular cells, they produce this liquor folliculi and liquor folliculi accumulates in antrum. As the fluid buildup continues in the antrum, this graphene follicle, it swells like a cyst. So because of the internal high pressure of the fluid, this theca, it bursts open. Theca cannot bear the pressure. Theca cannot withstand the pressure. So because of high pressure of liquor folliculi in the antrum, this theca bursts open. As the theca bursts open, secondary oocyte is released from the mature graphene follicle. This release of secondary oocyte from the graphene follicle, it is known as ovulation, right? So luteinizing hormone helps in ovulation, right? So this is what happens during the proliferative phase. So we will again summarize some of them. So this proliferative phase, it begins with the release of follicle stimulating hormone from anterior pituitary. As anterior pituitary releases follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the growth of a primary ovarian follicle into a graphene follicle, right? Then the follicular cells of graphene follicle, they start producing estrogens. Estrogens, they act on this fallopian tubes. Estrogens, they make their effect on fallopian tubes. They stimulate the growth of ciliated epithelium in fallopian tubes. So they prepare the fallopian tubes to carry the released secondary oocyte towards the uterus, right? So they make the fallopian tubes ready for transport of secondary oocyte towards the uterus. Estrogens further act on uterine endometrium. They stimulate the growth and development of uterine endometrium. They make uterine endometrium glandular and vascular. Estrogens, they stimulate the growth of uterine glands so that uterine endometrium becomes rich in glands, right? They stimulate the proliferation of blood vessels in the uterine endometrium so that uterine endometrium becomes highly vascular, right? So under the influence of estrogens, the thickness of uterine endometrium is increased by 3 millimeters, right? And this uterine endometrium becomes glandular and vascular, right? Then under the influence of estrogens, luteinizing hormone is released. Estrogens, they stimulate the release of luteinizing hormone from anterior pituitary. As anterior pituitary releases luteinizing hormone acts on follicular cells. It stimulates the follicular cells to release a fluid, liquor folliculi, into the antrum. As the follicular cells release this liquor folliculi into the antrum, this fluid accumulates here in the antrum and it builds up internal pressure. It builds up internal pressure on the theca. As the pressure buildup continues, this theca cannot withstand the pressure. This theca could not hold the pressure. And because of continuous internal pressure, the theca bursts open. The theca bursts open. As the theca bursts open, secondary oocyte is released from the Graafian follicle. This release of secondary oocyte from the Graafian follicle, it is known as ovulation, right? And this ovulation occurs under the influence of luteinizing hormone. When this ovulation occurs in the second phase, that is known as ovulatory phase. So it prepares the mature Graafian follicle. Luteinizing hormone prepares the mature Graafian follicle for ovulation. This ovulation occurs in ovulatory phase. That is on 15th day of menstrual cycle. Ovulatory phase lasts only for 1 day. Ovulatory phase lasts only for 1 day. So ovulation occurs on 15th day of menstrual cycle. So on 15th day of menstrual cycle, this mature Graafian follicle will burst open and it will release secondary oocyte. And this secondary oocyte will go into fallopian tube. It will be caught by the fimbriae. Then the ciliated epithelium of fimbriae, they will guide it into ostium and it will go into ampulla, and from it will go into infundibulum, and from infundibulum then it may go into ampulla, then isthmus, then into the uterine part, then into the uterus, right? So this ovulatory phase, it occurs on 15th day of menstrual cycle. It lasts for just 1 day, and this ovulation occurs under the influence of luteinizing hormone, right? Any doubt about these two phases? समझ आया?
No, sir.
नहीं आया
Yes,
सर?
sir.
अगर कहीं डाउट है तो बताओ. Okay. So that was about the first two phases, proliferative phase and ovulatory phase, right? Now we will discuss the third phase of menstrual cycle. Now we will discuss the third phase. Third phase of menstrual cycle is known as luteal phase, luteal or progestational phase. So on which day this phase will start? On which day? It starts on 16th day of menstrual cycle and it continues up to 28th day of menstrual cycle, right? So it starts on 16th day of menstrual cycle and continues up to 28th day of menstrual cycle. So it may last for some 12 to 14 days. It may last for some 12 to 14 days, right? We know proliferative phase that started on 5th day, continued up to 14th day. On 15th day, ovulation occurred. Then on 16th day, starts the luteal phase or progestational phase. And it continues up to 28th day. So it may last for 12 or 14 days, right? What happens during this phase? What happens during this phase? During this phase, an empty Graafian follicle is converted into corpus luteum. It is converted into corpus luteum under the influence of luteinizing hormone. Under the influence of luteinizing hormone, right? So after ovulation, what remained there? After ovulation, what remained there? When ovulation occurred, there was empty Graafian follicle. Now, under the influence of luteinizing hormone, now this luteinizing hormone, it converts this empty Graafian follicle into corpus luteum. Corpus means a body. Corpus means a body. And luteum means yellow colored. So luteinizing hormone, it converts empty Graafian follicle into a yellow colored body known as corpus luteum, right? This corpus luteum is fully formed on 19th day of menstrual cycle. It is fully formed on 19th day of menstrual cycle. Corpus luteum is fully formed on 19th day of menstrual cycle. And this corpus luteum, it then acts as an endocrine gland. Now this corpus luteum acts as an endocrine gland. When it is fully formed, then it acts as an endocrine gland. And it starts the release of some hormones. It starts releasing progesterone hormone and estrogens. It starts the release of progesterone and estrogens. Do you understand what I'm saying? In the luteal phase or the progestational phase, why we call it as luteal phase? Because in this phase, empty graphene follicle will be changed into corpus luteum. That is why it is known as luteal phase. So in this phase, under the influence of luteinizing hormone, the luteinizing hormone will convert an empty graphene follicle into a yellow colored body known as corpus luteum. Corpus luteum will be fully formed on 19th day of menstrual cycle. When the corpus luteum is fully formed, it starts releasing its own hormones. So corpus luteum now acts as an endocrine gland. It starts the release of progesterone and estrogens, right? These progesterone and estrogens, they further act on the female reproductive system. Okay, they act on female reproductive system. They further stimulate growth of cilia in fallopian tubes. Progesterone and estrogens further stimulate thickness of uterine endometrium. They further stimulate the thickness of uterine endometrium. Now uterine endometrium becomes approximately 5 millimeter thick, right? They make uterine endometrium highly glandular and vascular. So like estrogens, progesterone and estrogens together now further stimulate the growth of cilia in fallopian tubes. So the fallopian tubes are highly densely ciliated so that they can efficiently carry the secondary oocyte or the fertilized ovum towards the uterus. Progesterone and estrogens further stimulate the thickness of uterine endometrium. The uterine endometrium is made more thicker so that the fertilized so that the developing embryo, the blastocyst, can easily get attached into the uterine endometrium. So the thickness of uterine endometrium is increased so that it can easily accommodate the blastocyst. It can easily allow the attachment of blastocyst into it, right? Uterine endometrium becomes highly glandular so that these glands can produce the uterine milk, a nutrient for the developing embryo. And the uterine endometrium becomes highly vascular so that when the placenta is formed, the embryo gets enough blood supply for its development, right? So these changes are brought about by progesterone and estrogens. And these progesterone and estrogens, they are released by corpus luteum, right? So these changes happen in the luteal phase or progestational phase. Now we are running out of time. This is section for today. We will discuss the remaining part in the next lecture. Okay? Any doubt so far? Okay, thank you. Thank you for being with me. Thank you.